Welcome to the Triangle Association of Freelancers Spooktacular October meeting. I am Rita Lewis. I will be your Zoom host tonight. We are delighted to have William Stout as a guest. Don Vaughn will be facilitating the discussion with Bill. So let me introduce Don, who is the founder and guiding light of TAF. Don, take it away.
Thank you, Rita, so much. I appreciate it. I'm just going to say this right off the bat. William Stout is my absolute favorite artist. I discovered him several years ago. I fell in love with his work immediately, and I started collecting everything I could find that he put pen to paper with. Let me tell you a little bit about Bill Stout. Bill Stout is an award-winning artist and one of the most influential paleontological artists of his generation. His 1981 book, The Dinosaurs, A Fantastic New View of a Lost Era, was one of the inspirations for Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, and his massive murals and smaller paintings of prehistoric life can be found in several museums of natural history around the country, including the North Carolina Museum of Natural History in Raleigh. Bill's work has appeared in comic books, on record albums, and his trading cards. He has created posters and advertising for more than 120 films and has worked at various creative capacities on more than 30 feature films, including both Conan films, First Blood, Return of the Living Dead, Men in Black, Pan's Labyrinth, and Stephen King's The Mist, among others. A devoted conservationist, Bill visited Antarctica and Patagonia in 1989, a trip that changed his life and resulted in a 45-painting one-man show titled Dinosaurs, Penguins, and Whales, The Wildlife of Antarctica. Bill's latest book is Fantastic Worlds, The Art of William Stout, a magnificent volume. Now, I've had the pleasure of interviewing Bill for a large number of publications over the years, and I have found him to be not only one of the most interesting and knowledgeable people I've ever met, but also one of the nicest. Bill, thank you for joining us this evening.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Now, this is October. Halloween is down there, is coming up on us. So let's talk about horror. And by that, I think we need first to define our terms. So let me ask you, what to you defines horror in literature and cinema? What are some of the aspects that need to be there to meet that definition?
Should be scary. But you know, that seems like a gimme. You know, there's so many different kinds of horror. There's a horror I'm loving and passionate about, which is like the Universal horror movies, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolf Man, Invisible Man. Love those. And then there's the Hammer films, which is sort of an update, a redo of the old Universal films. And then there's Stephen King novels. There's horror writers, writers who tend to basically write solely in that genre. Although Stephen King's done a few other things too, such as Shawshank Redemption. So it's just stuff, for me, it's stuff that tickles that sort of strange bone I have somewhere in my body of that wants to be scared. And having worked on so many horror films, it's now really difficult to scare me in a horror movie. So when that happens, boy, that's a big achievement in my mind.
I do want to talk with you about your movie work, which is extensive. To me, the definite horror is a supernatural, people being menaced by a supernatural entity, to me, I think. So I wanted to ask you, do you consider Frankenstein science fiction or horror?
Oh, it's both, easily both, because the science fiction aspect of it is this guy putting this together, this creature from body parts. And the horror is the situation that Dr. Frankenstein ends up in. By the way, if you've never seen it, and if you ever get a chance, the National Theatre of London did a phenomenal production of Frankenstein, directed by Danny Boyle, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller. And Johnny Lee Miller and Benedict Cumberbatch would play Dr. Frankenstein and the creature. And then the next night they'd switch. And then the next night they'd switch back. And it is so incredible. And for me, the favorite version is Johnny Lee Miller's The Creature and Benedict Cumberbatch's Dr. Frankenstein.
Is that available online?
Unfortunately, it's not right now. They re-released it about 4 or 5 years ago during October, around Halloween. and you could watch it on YouTube. But I think the only thing you can watch right now is a trailer for it. I'm hoping they'll bring it back, because actually they should put it out as a Blu-ray, because it's phenomenal.
That sounds awesome. It really does. Bill, I was curious what your introduction was to horror literature. What are your earliest memories of horror stories?
Well, my parents wouldn't let me see horror movies until I was about 8 years old, and the Shock theater package arrived to television. And that was the very first chance I ever got to see Frankenstein, Dracula, all the Universal classics. I was a very early reader. My dad taught me to read when I was about 3. And so I think it was probably about the 5th grade, I dove into Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the novels. And I found that the Dracula was easier to read. The style of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was fairly archaic and difficult for me as a 5th grader, although I did complete reading the entire volume. But I think those are the first 2 major horror novels that I ever experienced.
After that, and those are classics, you know, Frankenstein and Dracula. After that, did that kind of lead you towards a greater interest in horror fiction? Did you
It did. It led me right into Edgar Allan Poe, which was not difficult to read, which was absolutely fantastic.
Now, you mentioned Poe, we mentioned Stoker, and Shelley, which most people know. But let's talk a little bit about some of the lesser known horror writers from the late 1800s and the early 1900s that really, really made an impact on the genre. I'm talking about people like J. Sheridan Le Fanu and H.P. Lovecraft and A. Merritt, just as a couple of examples. Can you talk a little bit about those individuals and their contemporaries and their influence on horror literature moving forward?
I was a big fan of Robert E. Howard, because it started with the Frazetta covers for the Conan books. I read all those books, but then I started to devour all the other Howard material I could find. And I learned that Howard was one of the writers involved in the Cthulhu mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft. So that led me to Lovecraft, and I became a big Lovecraft fan. For me, I love the way that Lovecraft would begin a story and everything would seem normal. Then he'd change a little thing, barely noticeable thing. And he kept doing that throughout the story until suddenly you're engulfed in this fantastic world of horror without even realizing how you got there. His novel, At the Mountains of Madness, is one of my favorite pieces of horror literature. And it was one of the big reasons I went to Antarctica for the first time, because that's where that novel took place. And I wanted to see how close his novel was to the actual place of Antarctica, because his writing made it seem so real. I had to find out.
Let's talk a bit about contemporary horror. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Richard Matheson. One of probably my favorite fiction writer, to be truthful. And of course, there's Stephen King. Those individuals aside, who really makes it work for you among the more modern horror authors?
Well, I know you said aside, but Matheson for sure. I mean,
Hell House.
And I just feel like the luckiest guy in the world. I got to illustrate the only children's book Matheson ever wrote. It was a book called Abu and the Seven Marbles. And man, we won a ton of awards for that book, but the biggest reward for me was doing the book signings with Richard and being able to talk to Richard and share stories. He turned out to be one of the nicest guys I've ever met in my life. At one of our book signings, I asked him, I said, has there been any interest from Hollywood in Abu and the Seven Marbles in the book? He says, oh yeah, I've been getting lots of calls. People want to option it. I tell them though, I will option it under the one condition. You have to have William Stout as the production designer for the film. And I said, Richard, just take the money. Don't worry about me. But that's the kind of guy he was. Really incredible. So I work so hard. I work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, that I have very little time for pleasure reading. So I am not up to date with current horror novels, unless they're written by friends of mine. Like I read everything that Mick Garris writes. And man, any Matheson stuff that I missed, I'll dig that up and read that. Of course, Ray Bradbury was a very dear friend of mine, and one of my favorite books of all time is Something Wicked This Way Comes. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. One of the things I love about that particular book is I first read it when I was a teenager. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, my God, how does this guy know me so well? This book, it feels like this book was just written for me at my certain age. And I was just astounded. Then I reread the book about 6 or 8 years later, and I thought, well, how foolish of me. That wasn't written for a teenage kid. That's written for a guy my age. And then I read it about 6 years later, and it's like, what was I thinking? This book it's written for fathers. It's all about fatherhood. And the fact that that book has so many levels and layers to it, that I can go back to it every few years and read it and come away with something completely different from the last time I read it. I think it just goes to show what a master of metaphor Mr. Bradbury was.
I'm glad you mentioned Ray Bradbury, Bill, because I don't think a lot of people really think of him as a horror writer. But wasn't a lot of his very early published work in the genre?
Yeah, he wrote some chilling horror stuff.
Small Assassin, for
That's
example.
the one I was thinking of. That one, that's maybe my favorite. That was just, it turns your blood to ice when you read that last page. It's just amazing.
And the EC Comics adaptation of that story, I think, was marvelous.
Yeah.
They really did a great job with that.
Was that Crandall or was that George Evans? Do you recall?
I want to say Evans. I think it was George.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think that Crandall would have done an excellent job also. Bill, I wanted to ask you, why do you feel that horror is such a popular genre? And what do you personally get out of it? Why do you enjoy horror?
I enjoy it because it gives me a thrill that other genres don't. It sort of speaks to a playful dark side of me, and I don't know, it's tantalizing. In one way, it's sort of forbidden fruit. It actually was forbidden fruit for me when I was a kid, because my parents thought I'd have nightmares if I saw horror movies. Although I was fascinated, even though I couldn't see those movies, I was fascinated by them. And my mom was a huge horror movie fan. And so I would pump her for information about what these creatures look like. For instance, I'd say, Mom, I want to draw a werewolf. What does a werewolf look like? And she said, oh, they're all hairy. So I drew a guy with a beard.
Close.
Yeah. I had no idea.
What are some of your favorite horror tropes, Bill? And there's a lot of them out there.
Are you talking about many genres within the horror?
Yeah, haunted houses, ghost stories, going back to Henry James. We're talking about Matheson and his classic book, The Haunting of Hell House. I'm thinking The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, but also Matheson's Hell House, which is just a staggeringly good horror book.
Yeah, Legend of Hell House it's a pretty good film too. Pretty good film adaptation. I kind of like all that stuff. I feel like I'm at a visual smorgasbord when I'm trying to pick a horror film, because I love the whole haunted house genre. And I even love the haunted house horror comedies. One of my favorites is Murder, He Says, and which is just one of the wackiest screwball comedies I've ever seen.
There's been a really a huge number of horror movies over the past decade. Why do you feel that this genre has really pumped up the way it has cinematically over the past few years? And Blumhouse, for example, is just, they're churning them out weekly, it seems.
Before I answer that, can you recommend some of the better Blumhouse films? Because I just watched a documentary that they did that I thought was really good.
The one that really affected me the most was the first Paranormal Activity film. I think that was one of theirs. And I think Blumhouse also was doing the ones based on the Ghost Hunters, the real life couple.
Oh, sure.
Like Insidious and movies like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But truthfully, my interest in horror movies is actually older than that. I'm not especially interested in the more contemporary stuff. I like the old stuff, you know, like you were talking about Haunting of Hill House and Hell House and all of those. To me, those I think are better films. The new films to me use too much of jump thrills, you know, my scare jumps.
That's a pet
That's
peeve
not
with
my
me.
thing.
Yeah, it's a pet peeve with me. It's so easy to do,
It's lazy.
it's totally lazy. But there have been some really good horror films lately. There's been sort of almost an avalanche of horror movies. One of the reasons is they're typically cheap and easy to make. Well, not necessarily easy to make, but they're inexpensive to make, and there's a reliable audience for horror. So I think that's one of the reasons we see so much of it. But if you saw the recent Invisible Man, I thought that was done very well.
The one with Moss.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thought that turned out great. There's a new genre. It's a science fiction genre. I call it the time loop genre. And there have been a lot of time loop movies popping up lately. The first one was probably Groundhog Day. But there's a Map of Tiny Little Things, terrific film. Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise, terrific. What else? Oh, I'm a huge fan of Richard Curtis, and he wrote a film called About Time.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful film.
I love time travel films. I really do. And stories also. You know, let's talk on the theme of movies, Bill. Let's talk a little bit about a horror and your creative efforts.
Okay.
Let's start a little bit with your art. You've drawn your share of zombies for comic books and other media over the years. Let's talk a little bit. Tell us where you're coming from when it comes to horror professionally for you in the work that you create.
Well, it used to be every January I'd get 5 screenplays with offers to production design the film, so I'd have to decide which ones I was going to do. I am a sucker for originality. I don't want to do stuff I've seen before. I don't want to do anything that's hackneyed. And so a script that can surprise me, that's a big plus in my wheelhouse. The first horror film that I worked on as a designer was actually Conan and Barbarian. If you recall, the Conan stories were originally published in Weird Tales magazine, which was a horror magazine. And Ron Cobb and I endeavored to keep as much of the horror of Robert E. Howard's stories that was within those stories. Not long after that, I wrote the treatment for Galaxy of Terror. I worked on a real low budget film called Monster in the Closet. The fun thing for me was that there was this big monster in the closet, but that wasn't the real monster. The real monster was when he opened his mouth and there was another monster inside that popped out and bit you. Then I worked for 2 years on Godzilla King of the Monsters in 3D. That's a film sadly didn't get made, but I had a dream art department. I had Dave Stevens and Doug Wildy doing storyboards for me. Rick Baker was building a gigantic robotic Godzilla head for me. Dave Allen was going to do the stop motion animation. And Steve Cherkis had built the stop motion figure for David. I worked a little, then I did Return of the Living Dead, which has become a gigantic cult film. I think it's more popular today than when it came out.
Let's talk a little bit more about that particular movie, Bill, because I think on the theme of horror, our topic this evening, that is a really unique combination of horror and humor. There's a lot of laughs in that movie, and it is just eminently quotable. Tell us a little bit about your involvement. And it was a super low budget film, wasn't it?
Yeah, $1.5 million.
That's it?
Yeah. And then actually at a certain point, Dan kicked in about $100,000 of his own money to finish the film.
How did you get involved with that? And what were your specific responsibilities?
Well, Ron Cobb was a very gregarious guy, and he used to throw a lot of parties. And Dan O'Bannon was one of his closest friends. It was Dan who wrote Alien, and Ron was part of the Alien package that helped get the film made. Ron ended up designing the Nostromo. And at these parties, I would usually bring some piece of art that I was working on just to get feedback from people. And Dan O'Bannon would always be the first guy in line to see the new art that I had brought. And what I didn't realize at the time, he was sizing me up as to whether or not he thought I could be the production designer for the Return of the Living Dead. And at one of these evening events, I brought a comic book cover I had done for Alien Worlds, and it showed an astronaut sinking beneath the ground, being surrounded by these little creatures. And it was the suit that I designed for the astronaut. Dan told me later, he said when he saw that suit, he thought, aha, Stout can do high tech. That was the only thing he was worried about, as to whether I could handle the high tech aspects of the film. So when it came time to hire the production designer, Dan gave our line producer a very short list, just 2 names, Bernie Wrightson and me. And I think Bernie Wrightson was Dan's first choice. But Graham Henderson, the line producer, he did his homework. He called around town, found that I already had a track record in motion pictures. And I think Bernie was just beginning to dip into film with Ghostbusters at the time. So he lied to Dan and said, I couldn't get Bernie, but I got Stout. And so I became the production designer for the film. For those out there who are not in the business, the production designer is responsible for everything you see on the screen except for the performances of the actors. So I'm in charge of all the sets, makeup, special effects, makeups, props, set dressing, you name it. If it's on the screen, it's under my domain. Back then, it would be more now because of the computer revolution, but back then I would typically have about 1,250 people working under me when I was production designer. So I approach production design very pragmatically. I read the script, and then I read it a second time, and I make notes on how many sets there are, and if the budget is realistic in terms of those sets. And then I might do some sketches after that on the side of some of the more important elements of the film. And that's exactly what I did beginning the Return of the Living Dead. Dan came to me and he said, Bill, you know how films have principal actors? I said, yeah. He goes, our film's going to have principal zombies. I want you to design zombies that like no one has ever seen before. I don't want them to look like George Romero zombies with just dark rings around their eyes. I want these to be star quality. So the first one I did was the Tar Man, and that was a huge hit. I knocked it out of the park on the first try. Dan loved it. But I have to give half the credit for the He-Man to the guy that was in the suit, Alan Troutman. Alan can move as though his bones aren't connected, and he brought that suit to life, which is why I will never, ever put a stuntman in a monster suit. It always has to be an actor, because the actor will bring so much to that performance, and he'll make that real. Frank Langella, even though his face was covered by a skull mask in Masters of the Universe, did a fantastic job in that film. And he told me that's his favorite role of all time, of all the films that he's done. And he's done some unbelievable, important movies, but he said his favorite role is Skeletor.
Well, would you consider Return of the Living Dead kind of an almost unofficial sequel to George Romero's Night of the Living Dead?
No, I think it's completely different.
So a whole different zombie thing.
Well, different. I mean, even the zombies are different. Ours was the first zombie film where zombies could run, could move fast. Ours was the first one where they ate brains. Jon Stewart used to quote from the film every week when he was the host of The Daily Show.
Well, if those of you out there, if you've never seen Return of the Living Dead, I highly recommend you find it either online or on DVD or whatever. It's just a wonderful, hilariously funny, scary as hell movie with some great zombies. And like you were underneath the table, there's a half corpse. Yeah. Tell us the half corpse story, Bill.
Oh, sure. There's a scene in the film where the zombies are trying to get inside the mortuary, and one of them grabs one of the punks, whose name was Scuzz, and pulls him through the wall, and then he pulls back, and she gets cut in half by the other characters in the film. And she's cut from the spine, it's spine to the top of her head, and they strap her to a gurney, and they have a conversation with her. She talks about how painful it is to be dead and be brought to life, but that's the reason they eat the brains. It takes away the pain. And this corpse, it was a puppet, this half corpse, and it was built for me by Tony Gardner from My Designs. And Tony was operating the arms and the hands the fingers were able to move and everything. I was underneath the gurney operating the spinal cord and having the spine flip around and lose spinal fluid. And then Brian Peck, the guy who actually gets attacked by the half corpse, he was operating the head and doing a temporary vocal track for her. So it was a real team effort. I'm a real hands-on production designer. I like being on the set every day. I like making sure that everything is, at least from the art department point of view, is going smoothly.
Oh, a question.
Sure.
How much computer assisted work do you use in design now? 3D programs such as Maya or Photoshop for graphics and so forth. You know, great building the puppet, but I wonder, is it more and more now using the 3D
well, it seems like it is, but not for me. I use whatever tool accomplishes the job the best and the cheapest. I really always have an eye on the budget line of the film. But at the same time, you know, so if CG works better than a puppet, I'll use CG. But if a puppet works better than CG, I'd much rather use a puppet because you get everything in the can. You don't have to fix anything in post-production. So as far as my own computer use, I have very few computer skills. When I do comic books though, I color them in the computer. That's just much more efficient than hand coloring the comics. And I use Photoshop for that, but that's about the only program I use. There are other people who are fantastic at that, and I will hire them.
Bill, what do you consider the first horror movie?
Oh, it'd probably have to be Edison's Frankenstein.
Yeah,
that's
1910.
Pretty cool. Yeah, pretty ancient. It's still pretty cool too. I like that he emerges from a vat of chemicals, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's about what, 20 minutes long?
Yeah,
I think, and used to be considered a lost movie, and then thank God they found all the elements for it. Yeah. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the 1922 version of Nosferatu.
Oh, hey,
watched that recently. Yeah, that is a scary as hell movie, and Max Schreck rocks that character. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this was kind of an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula, right?
Yeah, in fact, Mrs. Stoker, the widow of Bram Stoker, sued and had every copy of that film destroyed. Fortunately, she missed some copy that was hidden in a vault somewhere in Eastern Europe. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't know what Nosferatu looked like. To me, it is the greatest vampire design ever. Max Schreck is phenomenal in that role and so creepy. When I did this T-shirt, I did a poster for Nosferatu for Mondo. I watched it again a couple times, and I was amazed at how that film holds up and how eerie and creepy, and there's so many fantastic elements to it. Like when he's loading all the crates of earth onto the wagon, and then he puts the last crate on there, it's empty, and then he levitates and goes into the into the box. It's just fantastic on every level.
Well, and Murnau's use of shadow and light is just amazing in that movie.
Yeah.
And really adds to the horror and the terror of what's going on. Just a very effective movie.
Yeah, for me, that's the first and earliest really powerful horror film. Because it's powerful from start to finish.
On the issue of movies, horror movies, what takes you out of a story? If you're watching a horror movie, we've talked about popular tropes that make an effective movie. What are some of the things that just, we talked about jump scares, for example. Is there anything else on the horror front that you're just tired of, or something that just really ruins the experience for you?
I like being surprised, and it takes a lot to surprise me. I took a writing course with Robert McKee, the fellow who they based part of adaptation on. And I learned so much about screenwriting, so much that I'd say 90 to 95% of the films that I see, in the first 10 minutes, I'll tell you how it's going to end because of that writing course. And so it's really, it kind of kills a lot of the pleasure I have in watching movies, knowing just what's going to happen. And so when a film comes along that doesn't do that, that is constantly surprising me, like say Terry Gilliam's Brazil, I am over the moon. I am so delighted that something that original can get made. And Guillermo del Toro's films too. Wonderful.
Let's talk about that for a moment, Bill. You're good friends with Del Toro, and you worked with him on Pan's Labyrinth, which I think is among his most famous and popular movies.
I think it's his masterpiece.
Tell us a little bit about your work with that, and also what makes Guillermo del Toro so effective as a horror director and writer.
I would say it's his integrity. He has a tremendous respect for the genre. And it was funny. We share a lot of mutual friends. They all kept saying, Bill, you got to meet Guillermo. You two will hit it off. You're like two peas in the same pod. And finally, I got the chance. A dear friend of mine and a great collector of mine, Frank Darabont, used to hold a sort of dinner banquet during Comic-Con on Thursday night. And he would invite all his favorite artists, but also occasionally a few directors, Cronenberg, and this one particular time he invited Guillermo del Toro, and I was seated right opposite Guillermo. And sure enough, we hit it off. We enjoy so many of the same things. He came by my booth the next day and he bought 2 of my paintings. And he said, would you mind delivering them to my home? I have something I'd like to talk to you about. I said, sure. You know, we're both in the LA area. So I drove over and he showed me his unbelievable collection that he has at his home. And he began to discuss Pan's Labyrinth. He had done a few sketches and he wanted me to work as a designer on Pan's Labyrinth. Now in the middle of his pitch to me, the phone rang. And so he stopped and he answered the phone and I heard his side of it. It was like, oh, hello. Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'm so honored, but I'm sorry, I will have to turn it down. I need to make my little Spanish film now. And he hung up and I said, Guillermo, what was all that about? He goes, oh, that was Warner Brothers. They just offered me Harry Potter. I went, oh my God, my admiration for him just skyrocketed. This guy blew off the Harry Potter franchise so he could make his little Spanish horror film. My God, there's a guy with integrity.
And you created you designed all of these, right? The fawn,
No,
the whole 9 yards.
I wish I had designed the Pale Man. That was Guillermo's design. I think it was one of the most original creatures I've seen in decades. And I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. It was all Guillermo. I did the early designs for the fawn, for the Pan figure. I did designs for where the film takes place. I like drawing buildings too. And so Guillermo wanted a Basque style architecture of this structure. So I designed that. I designed, in the film, there's a big toad in the film. And originally it was going to be a stone toad with all kinds of runes and hieroglyphics and things carved into the stone of the big stone frog's flesh. But they ended up just making a big frog. And then I also designed a creature that got cut from the film. At one point, there was a very sort of innocent-looking little creature with large eyes, almost childlike or fetus-like. And as he's approaching you, his body is rising and falling, turning to smoke and almost like sand, and being rebuilt as you're watching him. And then he gets close to you, and suddenly out of his mouth pops this horse skull, which bites you in the head. So I designed that creature too.
What are your thoughts on the Walking Dead franchise, Bill? Both the comic book and the television franchise. Are you a fan?
I watched the first season because Frank Darabont created the series and he was a dear friend of mine. And then I was at Comic-Con and Frank was promoting season 2. And now typically when you deliver a hit, you get a bump in the budget. Frank had delivered the biggest hit in AMC's history with Walking Dead, and they cut his budget, which is just unheard of in the business. And they were saying things like, do we really have to see the zombies? Can't we just hear them outside? And Frank was very frustrated with this. Well, to add insult to injury, the day after Frank got back from Comic-Con, they fired him from the show. So because of that, and because of my friendship for Frank, I have not watched any other seasons of Walking Dead.
Darabont directed Stephen King's The Mist, and you were involved in that film as well. That is a scary as heck film.
That was terrific, and I was so happy that they also released a black and white version, because it's like the coolest Twilight Zone you've ever seen. But that film, yeah, I worked on that for one day. I read the Stephen King story, and I read Frank's script, and I did a bunch of creature designs and sent them off to Frank. And the next day I got diagnosed with prostate cancer. So my working on the film, it just wasn't going to happen. I had to focus on getting rid of the cancer. But the main thing that made it to the screen was I designed one of those big spiders that are in the film.
Why did Darabont go with the downer ending? Because the book, the story ends on a hopeful note.
I love the story's end. I really do. I thought that end was absolutely brilliant. So I was really surprised when Frank ended the film the way he ended it. The studio offered him $2 million if he would change the ending, and he refused.
Wow. That's dedication.
But I love in the short story though, it's fantastic. The guy's trying to find something, anything on the radio, and it clears up for just a moment, and he hears one word, and that word is hope. I thought, what a cool way to end that tale.
Both of them, the story and the film, work really, really well. Lastly, Bill, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the future of horror, both in literature and in motion pictures. Do you think we've seen it all, or do you feel that the genre has barely been tapped?
Oh, I think there's always going to be new visions and new versions of horror. It's an irresistible genre, and the people who are drawn to it or are serious about it, a lot of them end up making spectacular movies in that genre. And I think we're just going to see more of that, especially now that we have so much streaming avenues with Netflix and HBO Max and the other streaming venues. They're hungry for content. So one of the things that the public responds to is horror films, if they're good.
You know, one thing we didn't touch on though, Bill, is foreign horror, both literature and motion pictures. South Korea is producing some really remarkable horror work these days.
Some of the best stuff being done. Train to Busan.
Classic.
Killer. Just great. Hashtag Alive. Another great one. Oh man. Yeah. It's gotten so that if I see this Korean involvement, I thought, I better watch this because it made me happy.
Train to Busan, for those of you who aren't familiar, is basically a South Korean zombie movie, but it takes that particular trope to remarkable new directions and extremes. And it has one of the best endings, in my opinion, in a zombie movie in many, many years. And it is really genuinely a frightening film, I think. And
I love it, having worked on zombie films. I love it when I see a fresh new take on it. And Train to Busan is a fresh new take. The way they move, everything about that film is just fresh and original.
What are some of your other favorite zombie movies?
There's zombie movies. Shaun of the Dead. Another rare case of mixing comedy and horror and having that work. It's not a zombie film, but another example of horror and comedy working. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is, I think, their best film, and it's got the classic monsters in it too.
I just rewatched that not too long ago, and it still holds up in a really great way.
Yeah. There's been some subtle stuff like the vampire film that Scarlett Johansson did.
Under the Skin?
Yes, Under the Skin. There's that strange, I think it was an Iranian film with, I think the lead is a woman, and I think that's another vampire film. For zombie films, man. You
a fan of Dawn of the Dead, George Romero's first sequel?
I like it better than the first film, and I like the remake better than George's film.
I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
Bill, this has been great fun. It really has been wonderful. I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. I'd like to open it up for questions, if you don't mind. If you can give us a few extra minutes. The one person I want to introduce you to is Allison Hill and her daughter, Saren. Saren is a huge dinosaur fan. I actually bought one of your books for her at Wonderfest a few years ago. And when she found out that you were going to be our guest this evening, she was very excited. So I know she wants to say hi. Allison,
Okay,
you
there
need to
she
unmute.
There. Can you see? Thank you.
Ah, there she is. Oh,
Thank you.
oh, you're welcome. Oh, that's A to Z. Yeah.
Tell
So
them
do you
what
have
you
a-
want to be when you grow up.
A paleontologist.
Say it
That's
proud.
fantastic. You know, I'm a member of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology called the SVP. And when I first joined in the 1970s, it was about 95% guys. Now
Hey,
it's 50-50. Half of the paleontologists are women now. And my friend Sue Richardson, she's the one who discovered the Tyrannosaurus Rex named after her, the one called Sue.
Wow.
Oh,
Did you hear that?
So maybe you'll find a special new
Wow.
dinosaur. It'll be named after you.
She also
Sarah?
loves horror. What did we watch the other night? Say
Poltergeist.
Ooh, my grandson just watched Poltergeist too. Yeah,
Come
that.
here, cat.
Of course, she had to sleep with mommy afterwards.
Oh yeah.
Pussy.
All right, okay. Whoops.
Does anyone have any questions for Bill on the
I-
topic of horror or
I-
his art, his work? Allison?
Yeah, hold on. Let me get the cat and the child off me.
Oh sure.
Hold on. Ah. I actually well try. I write horror, but I'm not published yet. I do have a horror website where I've been trying to sort of promote female writers and directors. I don't know how many people go on my site, probably not many, but it's like, you know, I try. But you know, what is your advice for writers right now? Because I've got two books that are all, well, one is fully written, one is, you know, needs work. But the first one explores sleep paralysis, which I've experienced myself, but obviously, you know, I've
Mommy,
embellished it.
can I get some
Sh-
salty water?
In a minute, hold on, sorry.
That's okay. I've got kids too.
Yeah, so you know, what is your advice? Because you know, I've been close so many times, but it's been like it's you know, I've had New York agents look at it and say they really liked it, but there's always something. But and somebody was saying, it's like, why don't you turn it into a screenplay? And how practical is that these days? You know, to even try and get a screenplay sold.
I give the opposite advice. For a while, I was with Kevin Costner, and he asked me to be the production designer for Dances with Wolves. And I found out the story behind that. A friend of his had written the screenplay for Dances with Wolves, and he gave it to Kevin. Kevin said, "This is great. I really want to make this, but I'm not going to do it right now. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to write this as a novel." And the guy said, "Why? Why don't we just make the movie?" He says, if you write this as a novel, you will own the rights to it. If I just write it as a screenplay, I own everything, and you're cut out of the deal.
Wow.
Which I thought was really great advice from a friend.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's better to have this intellectual property that you own rather than trying to do it the opposite way.
Allison made an interesting point, Bill, about female horror writers. And so, I mean, Shirley Jackson is the one that comes to mind most readily to me. Are there any female horror writers that really impressed you growing up or more contemporarily?
None come to mind, but I bet there are.
That's the thing too. If someone asks me who's your, you know, my favorite horror movie, I think is I have two, Hostel, and I love Hostel. I think it was brilliant, and Nightmare on Elm Street, the original Nightmare on Elm
Sure.
Street, because it gave me nightmares for years. It really did, obviously, and I had sleep paralysis too, so that didn't help. So
Didn't the guy who wrote Hostel, didn't he
It's
also write
Eli
Invisible
Roth,
Man?
right?
Eli Roth.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking of someone else. There
Well,
a
he was the
guy who
director.
did-
I'm pretty
There's
sure
a guy
he
did Upload, who also, I believe, directed Invisible Man.
Hmm.
But Anyway.
Yeah, I don't think that was Roth.
No.
He did Hostel, and he's done a lot of stuff. And actually, he has a series on it, AMC, called The History of Horror.
Yeah, I started watching that.
Yeah, I need to watch that too.
It's a lot of fun. You'll like that. Does anyone else have anything for Bill? Well, we have him. Any questions at all?
Yeah, I have a question.
So Linda?
Does the same advice you gave to Allison apply to doing podcasts as opposed to original fiction?
I think podcasts and original fiction are two separate creatures. I think podcasts, for me, it's a form of advertising. It's a way of getting your name and face out there, and so that and hopefully people will get interested in what you do. But I love doing podcasts.
Do you have one personally, or are you often a guest?
I'm often a guest.
Any other questions for Bill? Marcus?
Me unmute here. Okay, got it. I took a screenwriting class a while back, and the teacher, when I walked in, the teacher said to the class, if you ever want to enjoy a movie again, you might want to leave now. Because
true.
you learn every tiny little detail about the process. And, you know, I've always been a huge special effects fan. And now that I know how everything is done, I used to have a terrible time with horror movies. They scared the hell out of me. Now they don't, because I'm like, oh yeah, I know how that gag was done. And, you know, oh, there's the prosthetic leg and blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that still scares me is psychological horror. And so I was going to ask you what your favorite psychological horror movie is, or book.
Well, wow. Well, Psycho comes to mind immediately just because it's part of the word psychological. Oh man, it's largely psychological, but partially sort of science fiction, but Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely terrifying. The fact that you can do anything you want as long as you don't sleep. Well, everybody has to sleep. So it just hooks you right in.
Yeah. Invaders from Mars kind of got to me too, because I was a kid when I watched it. And there was a kid in the movie that got like backhanded by his dad. And I thought, holy crap.
That was a shocking scene. Very shocking.
It really was.
I just showed that to my grandsons last week. I want to see how it held up. William Cameron Menzies, the guy who directed and designed the film, is one of my big heroes. He was the very first person to ever get the title of production designer. And that's because he directed a third of Gone with the Wind, and Victor Fleming did not want to share credit with anyone. And so it put David Selznick in a tough spot. And then he came to Menzies. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you a co-directing credit, but I have created a new credit for you, production design by William Cameron Menzies. And that was the very first time that phrase was ever used. Prior to that, they were called art directors.
Wow. Huh.
Bill, were you involved in the remake of that? Yeah.
Oh yeah, you bet. That was another Dan O'Bannon script, and Toby Hooper was the director. I'm a huge fan of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But that sort of leads into my favorite showbiz story. I was working on the remake of Invaders from Mars, and we had contacted the United States Air Force because we need a lot of military gear and equipment and stuff for the film. We hadn't heard anything back from them, and I started getting nervous because the shooting date was looming. And so I called the guy in the Air Force up. I said, you guys going to help us out with the making of our film? And he said, I'm sorry, but the United States Air Force cannot cooperate in the making of your motion picture. And I said, why not? You guys are the good guys. You're the heroes. You save the world. You kill the Martians. What's the downside? And he said, it's the official position of the United States Air Force that there are no Martians and there are no UFOs. I went, are you kidding me? That's the reason you're not going to help us out with this film? I was like, oh, I just couldn't believe it. Well, our storyboard artist, Keith Rosley, was an ex-Marine. He handed me a card. He said, call this guy. And it had his name, and it said, United States Marine Corps Public Relations Liaison Officer. So I called him up, explained what was going on. And he said, well, I have to read a script. I said, you will have the script within an hour. I will messenger it over to you right now. And this time I didn't wait. The next morning I called up the public relations officer of the Marines. And I said, so have you read the script? He says, yes, I read the screenplay. And I said, so are the Marines going to help us out? He said, you will have the full cooperation of the United States Marine Corps in the making of your motion picture. And I said, oh, that's great. Thank you. So that you don't have any problems? The Marines don't have any problems with Martians or UFOs? He said, son, it is the official position of the United States Marine Corps that the United States Marines have no qualms whatsoever about killing Martians. True story.
Any final questions for Bill? That is an awesome way to end this. But Joel, do you have a question?
Or Allison does.
It's not so much the question. I just wanted to mention that as I'm a retired sculptor, but the first sculpture I ever made was inspired by a horror movie. I don't know if you know the Trollenberg Terror, which was called
sure.
the Crawling Eye in the United States. And back, in the early 60s, the local TV station would run horror movies at 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays. And they ran it one day, and my younger brother, Michael, was just terrified of the Crawling Eye. And I had gotten a huge collection of modeling clay in different colors for Christmas. And it was right after Christmas. And so that night in my bedroom, I made a football-sized Crawling Eye. And being a big brother, then I crept out of my bedroom, across the hall in front of the bathroom, and then Michael and my youngest brother, John, are sleeping in bunk beds, and I put this huge modeling clay Crawling Eye right in front of Michael's face and go, Michael, it's the Crawling Eye, it's the Crawling Eye. Well, Michael's eyes pop open and he screams bloody murder. And I grab the Crawling Eye, run into the bathroom, throw the Crawling Eye under the bathtub, it was a clawfoot bathtub, and flush the toilet. And my old man's going, what's going on back there? You want me to come back and take off my belt? I just walk out and go, I don't know, Dad, maybe Michael just had a nightmare. And Michael's still screaming, the Crawling Eye, the Crawling Eye, the Crawling Eye.
You're a good big brother, Joel. I love that.
No. You can use Big Brothers as the horror monster, I guess.
So are you guys familiar with the Little Shop of Horrors magazine?
No, I'm not.
They focus on Hammer films, each issue. And Trollenberg Terror is going to be in the next issue. I just got the latest issue today. And
I gotta look that up then.
So
it's a great magazine. It really is.
It's so thorough.
There's a cult of it. In fact, one year for Christmas, my wife gave me specially made Crawling Eyes. As a lady in Maryland supplements her disability payments by casting eyeballs that are grotesque and then knitting around them and selling them as Crawling Eyes. So I bought 3. I got 3, and I just put them on the stairway going up to the bedroom. They were there for years. And no home should be without one.
Not at all.
Allison, did you have another question for Bill?
As you can see, I love aliens. So can you see my post?
Yeah. The United States Air Force would not approve. Yeah.
I want to believe. Good. Oh, the truth is out there. But I love everything alien. So does she used to like it. Now she's into Bigfoot. But
X-Files fan?
Yeah. What's your favorite alien movie? I like The Forgotten and Dark Skies and so many. Of course, Alien. But what's your favorite alien movie? Alien themed.
And Aliens and Close Encounters and that funny one. Was it an Edgar Wright film? It's about a car trip, and They
Oh,
have
Paul?
Yeah,
Paul.
Paul.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the funny alien.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about aliens, but they scare me more than any other kind of horror film.
Ooh,
They're
a
out
really
there,
good one.
Alice.
A really good one is the second Cloverfield film with John Goodman.
Cloverfield Lane.
Yeah, terrific.
Cloverfield Lane.
Oh my God, that is such a really good. It really keeps you guessing. It's wonderful.
That ending was a mind blower.
Yeah.
Love the ending of that movie. It was
Oh.
excellent. Oh, I-
Cool. Thanks.
Oh, sure.
Bill, I really appreciate you joining us this evening. This was great fun. Really enjoyed the conversation a lot. Before we let you go, any final questions for Bill? Anybody at all? Well, Bill, I hope that you've had a good time this evening also. And I'm going to encourage everybody to go out and buy your books. We mentioned this one. This is your first book, correct? This is the book that inspired Jurassic Park. And this is the reissue, is that correct?
Yeah, it's got 32 new pages of pictures.
And one more for people who are stronger than me, Fantastic Worlds, The Art of William Stout. This is a tremendous book. I devoured this book. Ask Nan. I bought it and I sat down and I was like, don't bother me. I got a lot of reading to do. It's a wonderful book. And Bill, we look forward to the books that you have forthcoming also, the ones that you discussed at the beginning of our conversation. So we'll let you go then. Thank you so very much for joining us this evening.
Anytime you want to talk about monsters.
Love it. It won't be, and also I'll give you a call because I need to talk with you, as I said, about a couple of upcoming articles. So I'll shoot you an email and we'll set some stuff together.
Great.
Always look forward to it. Thank you so much. Hope you have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bill.
Take care.